Hello and welcome to the Scholars Hub at Home. My name is Ali Gampel and I have the honor of working with the alumni engagement team here at York University. I'm particularly excited about today's session. Welcome to Toronto, no vacancies available. International students in the Canadian housing crisis. I'd like to first acknowledge the land that I'm on. Because we may not be gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. So please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Before we get started on our topic today, we'd like to conduct a quick poll. The question that's about to appear is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up on your screen, and I'll give everyone a moment to answer. Thanks. It's always helpful for us to know more about our audience. There we go. All right. If you need any help with the Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. That same button can be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period, and I'll ask those questions on your behalf. Please note that all your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and to our staff working behind the scenes, so please keep your comments relevant and respectful as always. All right, now I have the great honor of introducing Luisa Sotomayor, Director of the City Institute at York University and Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Housing in our Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Her research focuses on urban inequalities, exploring how housing systems and urban policies shape uneven urbanisms and everyday exclusions. She has led several major research projects on housing affordability and urban governance, including the StudentDwellTO partnership and SSHRC-funded studies on peri-urban housing in Colombia. As a registered professional planner, she holds a PhD in urban planning from the University of Toronto and actively contributes to advancing public debate on socially just housing policies in Canada and Latin America. I'd like to, at this point, welcome Professor Sotomayor. And there you are. So welcome. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Alison. I'm really excited to be here today and talk about this topic.
Awesome. So I'm going to turn off my screen and camera, and you can share your presentation, and I'll be back after we learn a little bit. So I turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Okay, so first of all, I'm super excited to talk about the topic of today. As someone who was welcomed to Toronto in 2003, I came to Canada as an international student. My own housing trajectory started not in a very good place, with a lot of difficulty securing housing, being waitlisted for university housing, not at York University, but a different institution. And my first experience being in Canada as an international student with a family and a baby, it really created a lot of complications for me. Still, I felt welcome, but it was not something that we discussed at the time. At some point, I was lucky enough to be offered family housing within campus, and that changed dramatically my situation because it was easier for me to access childcare for my kid. I was close to school, so the situation was so much better. 15 years later, in 2023, 2024, we find a lot of discussion about the experiences of international students and the housing crisis. Some opinion leaders proposing that study permits being cut, changes in policy. So it was really interesting to me to see how a topic that was not really paid attention to in the past years became very relevant to politicians, but also people who have an opinion, but also to those concerned with immigration and with higher ed policy. And recently, in a place like Brampton, of all places, we find international students protesting to have government to stop blaming them for housing and job crisis. So that's definitely interesting in the current moment because, as I said, like for the past few decades, Canada has been generous in welcoming international students. At the same time, not just international students, but students in general have very few times been featured in any housing debates. Typically, they're assumed to be temporary and they are said to have a housing advantage when compared to other groups. So in neighborhood talk, they tend to be blamed for basically putting pressure on rental housing markets. And so there's always been a bit of discrimination, but also very little attention to their needs and their situation in housing policy debates. You would hear, and it's in the popular imaginary, that students need to pay their dues as they are destined for well-of lives after graduation. After all, they're going to be professionals. They'll be able to afford different housing later on. We also know about these spaces adjacent to university campus that are called the student digs or the ghettos, and these are seen as the rite of passage sometimes. There's also this assumption about, oh, it was like that in my day, and that's how it should be. So all of these, like sort of understanding that take for granted student housing rules have been very common and basically have silenced a little bit student housing issues in policy in Canada, but also abroad. I think that something to consider is that as Canada faces a deep housing crisis, like we talk about the housing crisis every day, how it is really affecting people of all walks of life. We also need to pay attention to the interaction between student housing and what's happening in rental markets, and also how developers and other actors are paying attention to student housing, for example, as an investment. So we're seeing in the literature that, well, in the past, student housing was provided by universities. There's increased interest in looking at student housing as an investment. So there are commoditized and financialized actors who are investing in housing markets, including rentals, and those tend to be high-cost student housing. And at the same time, we've heard that rental affordability has deteriorated rapidly with significant growth in high-rent luxury and condominial rental units in a place like Toronto, and decrease in affordability in affordable apartments with rents under 1,000, which is what students would typically like to rent. We've also seen trends of how Toronto's vacancy rates oscillated and were very low historically over the past decade and so. During COVID, that changed a little bit, but vacancy rates have remained low. And in general, for young people in Toronto, but this is also like in the GTA, and there are wider trends in Canada, young people tend to be renters, and for this generation in particular, home ownership is not going to be an option. So we know that students are renters. Most students are renters. with some exceptions. So going back to the fact that students haven't been sort of considered in any policy debates about housing until very recently. In 2017, a group of researchers from the 4 universities in the city of Toronto, so University of Toronto, OCAD, Toronto Metropolitan University, and York University, we got together to examine the issues that students are facing in the housing market. And also the hurdles in terms of securing housing. And we pay attention to international students as well. Our perspective was to really center the student perspective, like learn from students themselves. We also talked to some experts and stakeholders in higher education and governments, but we really wanted to pay attention to what students had to say about their own experiences. And what we found is that there is a number of variations in student experience because the student body is highly diverse. So that's something important to consider. Students are not a specific demographic. They can be young or mature. A lot of the international students coming to Canada, 1 in 5 actually are coming with their family. So many of them are mature students, and the type of housing that they require is not the typical university dorm. And so we argued as part of this project that students face this sort of hidden curriculum because they experience so many hurdles that as they deal with all the issues in securing housing, they also learn to be resourceful, but also to deal with some of the discrimination they face and some of the exploitation. And that creates uneven academic, housing, and possibly professional and socioeconomic trajectories later on. Out of the cohort that we studied, international students were consistently the ones with most inadequate housing, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. These are also some examples of some of the work that emerged out of that research, where we talked about how the actors in housing provision, in student housing provision, are changing, and the increasing role of the private sector, oftentimes with higher cost for a specific type of luxury housing for students. But we also pay attention to how the governance of student housing has changed, how policy across levels of government has been mutating, and the effects of that. And we also pay attention to the neighborhood effects with a focus on Toronto's Chinatown and how students are transforming the neighborhood and the environment through their lifestyles and interactions as more students live in campus adjacent neighborhoods. So this is just some of the example of some of the engagement that took place through our research with StudentDwellTO. We used social media to reach out to students. We conducted a number of focus groups, but we also conducted interviews, focus groups, analysis of institutional quantitative data, and we also conducted some data visualization. In terms of who participated in our focus groups, here's a snapshot of the students, and in the map you'll see some of the densities of where the students in Toronto, in the 4 Toronto universities, attending the 4 Toronto universities live, which is basically all over the city and the GTA, with strong concentrations downtown, around York University, and then around the community colleges, although we didn't really at the time interviewed college students. So this data is only for university students. But consistently, international students were interested in telling us about their experiences. So in our outreach campaign, 20% of the students that we interviewed were international, which pretty much matches the proportion at the time of students in Toronto universities. So what we found, what did the students said in the out of the focus groups, both domestic and international? They complain about on-campus housing options. In general, they mention how oftentimes the units that are available are the ones that are expensive. an issue with student housing in Canadian universities is that they are also in need of retrofits. There hasn't been a wide government grants to keep refreshing and maintaining the good state of repairs. So there's quite an uneven experience in terms of the on-campus options. So you could get like the new student dorm with shiny facilities, but then there are some that really need upgrading. We also talk about how the current trend is towards condo-like high-cost residences, and those tend to be very unaffordable to many of the students who would have the affordability constraints. Other things like a student mandatory meal plans or the lack of kitchen access, sort of compromised as well affordability, food security, and many of the on-campus limitations end up pushing students to off-campus markets, market housing, like to the private rental off-campus. And as I was saying, the student housing body is very diverse. We increasingly see mature students needing family-appropriate accommodations, and those are really in short supply across the board. So what's the situation for market housing near campuses? It's a competitive market, it is expensive, and students are exposed to tons of risk of predatory landlord practices. So probably you've heard in the news, it was on the CBC and in all sorts of media, these accounts of students who thought they had secured housing from abroad, and they came to Toronto only to find out that the unit was already rented and that they had been a scam, that it was a scam. And so that was a common narrative that we heard. For students attending Toronto universities, they are already in one of the most expensive housing markets in North America. So that barrier on its own, it's important. And the housing that is available tends to be lower quality, but not affordable. It's both often unsuitable and unaffordable. Available options are often shared housing. And the quality of this shared housing in the form of rooming houses is not consistent. Like we found students enjoying sharing in a rooming house, and others that are, like we found experiences of students sharing with 16 others in one house, living with 4 other students in a basement apartment, or like in a situation that we would define as unsuitable housing. Also importantly is to note that students tend to have to move multiple times within a year. And that constant not knowing of where they will go next, the practice of subletting, it's a very important source of stress. And so it takes a toll financially and psychologically on them. Some students, though, decide to live far away. And what we found is that, yeah, affordable options are far away from campuses, but then longer commutes mean higher transportation costs and also an opportunity cost to participate in academic engagement, in tutorials. So students are calculating, well, if I just have a tutorial today, maybe I'll just skip. So they're missing out on important student engagement activities, socializing, networking. And for international students in particular, we found that this increases isolation where they live away from campus. We also know that increasingly students are choosing school based off where their parents live. And so increasingly we find for domestic students attending local schools, so that's limiting their options. Limiting students' ability to participate in activities, as I said, and curricular repercussions, as I said, like just trying to juggle long transit time, so they may skip here or there, or then trade. If they have high transportation costs, then they're consuming less food or not exercising, they don't have the time, so all of those trade-offs affecting their well-being. At the same time, as other people, not just students, have seen rising non-housing costs that also have a toll, because when we talk about student housing affordability, students oftentimes don't have an income, and they're on fixed income. And so these rising rent cost is pushing them to work extra hours, take farther shifts, and then again, taking away from their academic goals. There's high frustration about the financial burden of high cost in transportation. So housing and transportation go together. If transit was easier, was more affordable, it wouldn't be a problem for students to live a little bit farther in more affordable housing. But so this is also a source of frustration. So obviously, all of this is taking a toll on students' well-being, their physical well-being, things that the students reported feeling tired, low access to affordable, healthy, culturally sensitive food options on campus were reported. And they commented a lot on their mental well-being. So students feeling stressed all the time, stretching thin, disengaged from social networks. And so all of that adding to feelings of isolation. Some of the literature has talked about how international students tend to live like these separate lives, start only hanging out with other international students, so being a very isolating experience. And the current housing situation contributes to that, because it's not a situation where students have an opportunity to live more integrated in the academic community. So one of the students told us, mental health, I don't have any, it's all gone, everything else is crumbling in front of me, and I can relate it all back to my housing situation. So we know that housing is fundamental to health and well-being. And so for students, despite the fact that we don't talk about, like they are in the making, and they're young and they can overcome challenges, this is really impacting their well-being. We also heard from students who had experienced homelessness. And so like this student who told us, it's really hard because you don't know where you're sleeping or eating or whatever. You always feel like you're stuck. It's just really hard because you fall asleep in class a lot. I did have a locker, so where to store your belongings. Um, so until your housing stabilizes, it's really hard, and it's really hard to find housing in Toronto. So we heard a lot of experiences of homelessness, a lot of hidden homelessness. So students, in order to avoid the long commute, staying overnight in the university halls, and trying to conceal themselves so that they could safely remain in the institution. We also found that each campus has unique issues and student experiences. Since the work was conducted, which our research, our data collection phase ended in 2020, all Toronto universities have actually made tons of efforts and improvements. And they are very concerned and working towards, I'm sorry, increased opportunities. Each university is facing I'm sorry.
Don't worry at all. Take your time. And this is really, really interesting. Take your time, have some water, and we're right here with you. And as Louisa is just catching her breath, as our audience is listening, if you have any questions that are coming to mind that you'd like to ask after the presentation concludes, do feel free to click on that Q&A button and start to submit them. And then I'll ask the questions on your behalf once the presentation is done. So we'll go there. As hard as it is to find housing, it's really hard to do a presentation when you're coughing. So it's all good. Just come on back on when you're ready.
Okay, I'm so sorry, just recovering
No
from.
worries. Take your time and drink. We're here with you.
Okay, so As I was saying, each campus has unique issues and student experiences. In the case of York, this is data. I'm so sorry. Okay. In the case of York, this is data actually current. So there is still some vacancy on campus, particularly for undergraduate residences. Wow, okay. For undergraduate residences, the challenge is more for those looking for off-campus housing. So I just want to share with you some of the recent data analyzed by StatCan out of the 2021 long-form census. And so this chart is interesting. It tells us, it analyzes the top cities in Canada where international students reside. So you can see Toronto is the one with the most study permits. And you can also see the number of students living in not suitable housing at 37.2%, which is pretty high. When we compare these to Canadian-born students, it's still high, 24.3%, but we can see that definitely international students are being more affected by the student housing crisis. Some of the additional information that we found that affected international students specifically had to do with some of the requirements to rent a home and the sort of illegal practices that are characteristic of a very tight housing market. So students being asked to pay 6 months of rent in advance. Students asked to show credit history, right, when they're immigrating as a young person from a different place. But also understanding the local culture and how to move in the housing market. So those type of cultural competencies tend to put international students at a disadvantage. The fact that when references are requested, international students can hardly provide them. So this has created like an important challenge that is more significant for international students, although as you can see for Canadian-born students, is similar as well. And here I also want to bring your attention to Brampton, where we started with the Indian students in Brampton protesting against policy changes, reducing their opportunities for work. But here you would also see in Brampton, the prevalence of not suitable housing is at 63 for international students versus 20. So there's something else that is structural, we can assume, and after talking to students, we know that is the case, which has to do with discrimination and predatory practices in very tight housing markets. So here you can see the distribution of source countries by municipalities. So very high number of international students coming from India, coming from China as well. So again, looking at Brampton, 90.6% of permits in Brampton are given to students coming from India. And as you can see, like their unsuitable housing is very high as well for students coming from India. And that is important. So going back to the main argument that there is this hidden curriculum, what does it mean to say that there is a hidden curriculum? As the students come to Canada, and they have to experience and juggle and deal with these tight student housing this market, they are gaining all these other skills, which they are socialized on, is the other side of formal education, that are and the students is an education that is influenced by the pressure of external forces like the housing crisis. So the hidden curriculum emerges, for instance, when higher education institutions do not adequately meet students' housing needs, ignore resultants' life course challenges, or place the burden of finding solutions to housing, food security, and other related life necessities inordinately on students themselves. So that tells you a little bit of where we are going in terms of solutions as well. The hidden curriculum unfolds through a process of socialization, normalization. So as I said, like, these practices have been normalized for a long time. And also othering through these alienated experiences. So what do students learn from the hidden curriculum of student housing? They learn the attitudes and behavior of hyper-competitive and entrepreneurialized subjects that they are pushing to the hustle economy by taking on multiple jobs, and they become very visible. So we see these racialized international students that are delivering Uber Eats, and they are doing a number of things. And so they're expected to be resourceful, cunning with finding solutions to their housing, food, academic, and other life necessities. And in a way, this hidden curriculum, as it affects international students more profoundly, sort of the students learn to normalize these intersectional inequalities, like the expectation that the racialized students will be worse off. And the student housing crisis has brought that to the fore. At the same time, not everything is that negative. We also found that these hidden curriculum students are interacting with also create space for student-led solutions. Some are positive and some not that much, but so as I said, coping by working extra hours. So international students, we found they're working a ridiculous number of hours. They're picking up all the low-paying jobs. At the same time, they are, in order to improve their housing search, they use online platforms to find roommates, or they access housing through shared identity groups. They strategize to present themselves to landlords in a very professional manner. So we heard from students about how they dressed up to go to the open house. They really aim to present themselves in a very professional manner. They may bring a family member if they have to the viewings to show that they have support of an adult, but they have parental support, and that was more for the domestic students. There's also this initiative that we found at the Toronto Metropolitan University, where the students themselves have this couch surfing initiative to support those that live at a distance from campus. So there are spaces for those who attend late classes, and so they can stay downtown instead of going back to their home. And so they can also attend networking events and extracurricular activities in the evenings. Okay, so at York University, one very exciting initiative is initially the York Village Student Housing Association. So housing associations have started to emerge. This association in particular now became an NGO that is mobilizing students and the student unions to try to convince universities to partner together to develop new student housing. This specific group emerged as a way to advocate and to share resources for students that were victims of predatory practices in off-campus housing, like in the rooming houses outside of the York University. And in this system of support, they went farther and they started advocating, and now they are an NGO doing work all over Ontario. So that's also a very positive initiative from the current moment. So in conclusion, housing studies have really largely eluded students' perspectives, and only until this moment we're recentering the student voice, discussing student housing issues and the issue of international students. We argued that the inadequate provision or availability of student housing has introduced this hidden curriculum in higher education institutions today, and that differentiated circumstances in student housing, which are formative to the university student experience, may reinforce and reproduce social inequalities. The lack of adequate, affordable, and accessible housing for students has forced underprivileged students to tacitly learn to be resourceful, creative, and to hustle to survive in securing housing. And although these may sound very positive, right, as they are innovating to address the housing issues, these hidden curriculum and student responses to it have many unintended effects, because this saps time and energy from their studies and other university experience as students take up low-paying jobs, and all of these serve to further marginalize students in precarious situations and reproduce social hierarchies. So as we saw, the students that are the larger groups of students in inadequate housing are international students and are racialized as well. So we also talked about how students report they're feeling disengaged from their classmates, programs, and their higher education institution. The feeling of isolation is a real concern, and as many students coming to Canada have hope to take advantage of the opportunity to apply for the permanent residence stream. This will set these students for further challenges in integrating later on. And yet, students also turn to their own collective creative resourcefulness that also takes time and energy away from the study, or even suspend the university careers for a time or permanently. So we found a lot of students who had discontinuous educational careers, so they would take a leave for a term to work, so they would save enough money to resume their studies the following term. And so that has a lot of implications later on in their professional lives. So I would say that paradoxically, for the desires of Toronto as a world-class city, and for our institutions as these world-class universities, these issues are really important, right? Like, we're educating global citizens, and there's this idea of the high-earning knowledge workers, and yet the experience of the students are the ones of very marginalized workers and students. So it does behoove university administration to support student activism and include students in decision-making concerning housing needs and allocation. And with that, I'll conclude, and I'm happy to have a discussion if you have any questions for me.
Thank you so very much. That was so timely and informative, and it's really great to see your work taking the perspective of the students. It brings me back to my time at university. I was going on an exchange to Europe, and the university that I wanted to attend couldn't guarantee 19-year-old me that they would provide me with housing. And my parents actually didn't let me go to that university and found another option. And that was a really important point in our own decision making. So I can personally resonate to some of the things that you speak to. So thank you for sharing with us. I've got many questions, and our audience, if you have any questions, please just write them in, pressing the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. If you happen to be watching live on Facebook, please feel free to submit videos on the comment section there, and then I will ask them on your behalf. So, let's start with the first question, which is: are there any lessons from other cities that could inform, better solutions as we deal with university housing in this challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. So coincidentally, many of the policies that would benefit students are policies that would also benefit other groups experiencing affordability challenges. So in cities like Vienna or like Berlin, where strong tenant protections are available and regulate rentals, international students tend to experience less discrimination, right? Because there's strong tenant protections, and there's rights for the tenants, and so students can easily understand the rules of the game and access stable, affordable housing. There's also cities, for example, like Boston, Boston is a similar city to Toronto in terms of defining itself as a student city because it has so many great universities similar to Toronto. And what is interesting about the case of Boston is that the city of Boston and the universities collaborate very closely. So having said that, last year and this year, the City of Toronto has started to develop a post-secondary housing strategy, currently conducting an assessment, and they're doing some research. But the first step is to think easy things to do, like have a way to collect the housing demand of students. Like until very recently, universities did not have to report any numbers to the city, or the city didn't really consider what university plans were, with the assumptions that universities would figure it out on their own and that the local markets would integrate student needs. So now it's very clear that there needs to be a very a coordinated effort among levels of government, but also with the universities at the center, to make sure that students get all the supports that they need, that the housing that they're accessing is adequate, and that students know their rights. So that's also an opportunity. And in the case of York University, it's interesting because a lot of staff are now actively interested in supporting the students, working towards that support. But again, like it's been a process. So yeah, those are some of the things. Waterloo is also an interesting case. We can talk more about this, but I'll want to hear from if I can answer other questions.
No, I think folks are really interested in this. And as you talk about that and the role of universities, I know when I read your bio, you mentioned the Student Dwell Toronto project. Are there any examples of effective interventions from that particular project that you would share?
Yes. So one of the examples I mentioned, which is students organizing themselves, and that is such a York University thing, right? Like finding opportunities for collective action, for discussion among themselves, and mobilizing, action for change. So we found student organizing was important out of that study. We found that also opportunities are emerging in cities like Montreal, for example, where cooperative housing is being developed for students that are mature and that need housing off campus. So there is a nonprofit called UTIL. And they've done great work in Montreal, and they are now scaling up in other places. And the work is cooperative, keeps the housing affordable, so it's a great example. We also found examples of multi-stakeholder planning. So universities really incorporating a number of actors across the private, nonprofit, higher education sectors, and government in coming up with a comprehensive plan. So those are some of the ideas that came out from the StudentDwellTO that were also offered. Some of them, we also found suggestions from students themselves, some of them easy, right? Like so just to give you an example, like certain supports, information to be provided to students in a timely manner, more outreach to international students and support as soon as they arrive. So specific things to help accommodation of international students. But in general, we had a number of recommendations coming out, and actually they have been picked up in other reports. And now that cities are looking into the issue in more detail, some of those, like just comprehensive planning, focus on student supports, expanding options for students, like paying attention to the diversity of needs, going beyond the assumption of the young 18-year-old. Like we have a very diverse student body, and communication and multi-stakeholder planning.
Thanks. You know what? I was traveling over the holidays and I came back to Toronto and came through Pearson in international arrivals in early January. And it was actually really heartwarming. I saw a number of signs in the terminal that said, Welcome international students. And there were a number of different universities that had their logos on it, including York. So I was quite heartened to sort of see that welcoming environment to Canadian. To students arriving to Canada. I remember being so scared when I went to do my master's at an international school and, taking test runs to the border to see if they'd even let me in. So it definitely can be quite a challenging process on so many levels. But I like that you also noted the skills and the resilience that people develop that will serve them. So there's so many different sides. Um, Wanted to ask you about one initiative. I remember reading about it somewhere. It was an initiative around pairing students with seniors and creating, spaces, I guess, to alleviate some of the housing challenges where seniors and students might live together. Is that anything you've explored, or is that real?
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you're asking. I think it's an excellent initiative, and with one of my planning studios with my students, we examined the case of the home share initiative in Toronto, and we found that yeah, it provides benefits for the students who have access to more affordable rents and are able to support seniors who may be isolating and may need like basic support around the house, not a lot of support, and then it's companionship. The real problem with that is scalability, because to match the student to the senior is already a difficult thing in terms of, imagine finding a roommate, all that goes into it, like getting along with a roommate, and then add the differences in age and everything, and security for seniors as well. So it's a process that involves a a social worker and so on. So the scalability is more complex, but what the research says is that it's very promising in terms of supports, also considering that our long-term care facilities in Canada are like the wait lists are equally long, right? Like there is also a housing crunch for seniors, and many of them actually can live independently. So supporting seniors to live independently. So, but what we found, incidentally, some of my, like in the workshop that I taught, a group of our students developed this almost like a dating app where students and seniors could interact and find a match. So we didn't implement it, but it was an interesting idea. And I think it has a lot of promise. It's just the issue is scalability, right?
Right. And maybe it's something, if students could come and be in, residence in first year, but then begin to do that sort of dating to find a match in person and think about that for future years. Maybe there's some possibility there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a question coming in from one of our guests, Hannah, and I'm going to read the question. Hannah says, Thank you for the presentation. They're glad to hear about such intriguing research. I'm curious if you think there may be any differences in the findings or experience of students if the study included Ontario college students.
Yeah. Absolutely. I didn't present about the colleges today because our experience really was with the four institutions. My sense is that the four institutions were really interested in improving the student experience. They, with exception of OCAD, the three Toronto universities have dorms, and they're in a very different situation, and their percentage of the international student population is lower than you'll see in the colleges. The data that I showed from Brampton tells you, and we know, right, like there's about 100,000 students, international students in Brampton, attending colleges. And we've heard in the media what the situation is. I think that the data would look even more concerning, and there's currently studies. Other researchers at York University are paying attention to the colleges currently. The data would look even more worrisome because the experience in the colleges is being reported in the media that's even more concerning. And the data that we saw like tells you, right, like places that have no university but a very high um, permit holder international student population. They are attending colleges, and they are in a very in very high rates in core housing need, meaning in inadequate housing. Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing. At this point, we unfortunately have to wrap up. I know we could probably talk about this topic for so long. And so unfortunately we will have to wrap up. So Dr. Sotomayor, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your work, and keep up this great work finding innovative solutions, and in particularly really listening to the student voice and listening to their perspectives in creating solutions. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you everyone for attending. And yeah, reach out to me. My contact was on the slides. If you would like more information or to share some of the articles we develop, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. So I'll ask you to turn off your video and audio, and I'll just wrap up our session. We are going to just put on one more poll question for the audience. It should appear momentarily. It says, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? I know I personally learned a lot. So that's popped up. So feel free to click on your answer there. What's coming next in our Hub at Home series. Next on Wednesday, January 29th, we come back with Stephanie Gora from the Lausanne School of Engineering, who will be exploring drinking water management in Nunavut. And in addition, stay tuned for our February sessions that will include Peter Bax, who teaches in our biology area, and he'll be talking about the causes of atrial fibrillation, arrhythmia of the heart, strategies for treatment and prevention. That takes place on February 12th. And then on February 26th, we come with Professor Sylvia Bawa from the area of global sociology, and she'll discuss truth commissions as mechanisms for civic inclusion. So we really appreciate our panelists, our speaker today, Dr. Luisa Sotomayor, and the entire team that helps put together the Scholars Hub at Home series. Make sure you check out what's coming up next. York Circle is happening soon, where you will hear from York's faculty on a wide range of issues. And the next York Circle takes place on March 22nd. So stay tuned, as always, to register for these events and learn about everything going on for our alumni and friends. Visit us at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. And with that, I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.